Hey gents, here is your second video. Try and keep this one brief. This is a little bit of background that takes us from the Council of Trent up to Vatican I. Vatican I is a council that takes place in the 19th century. So we're ending the Protestant Reformation in the 1600s. Between then and the time period we're going to be looking at next is a period that's often called the Enlightenment. So let's take a look at what that looks like. The Enlightenment period you've probably studied in history. It's essentially a time period where people are looking to find capital T truth. What is true in light of the fact that we now have these competing ideologies of religion. And a lot of people say, and I kind of laugh at this, people call it, we have all these wars of religion, and we can look back on different periods of time and point to religion as the cause of war. First of all, if you look at it statistically, religion is not the most prominent cause of war. But in a certain sense, you got to remember how people were thinking back in these days, all right? People didn't have this idea, well, there are lots of different religions, all with different claims, but there's, science and all these other things that we can all agree on, right? In a sense, these weren't wars of religion, they were wars of truth. What I mean by that is, okay, so you believe that Jesus was God, and you believe that, he is truly present in the Eucharist. And because of that, you live a certain way, you act a certain way, you obey certain people, right? Well, I believe in something different, and I believe something else is true. And your truth and my truth can't both be right. One of us has to be right. And so these wars are kind of these ideological, like, who deserves to exist? Who can continue to keep existing because one of us is telling a lie, right? Our modern way of thinking, especially when it comes to religion, isn't that black and white. If you're a person who belongs to a specific religion, you may feel black and white about what it is that your beliefs are, but there is this lexicon, this entire realm where we can all go to and we can say that we can agree. And a scientist who's Hindu can agree with something that a scientist who's Catholic can say. And so the Enlightenment, in some sense, emerges from, well, we need this new way of looking at truth if there are going to be some things that we can't agree are true, all right? But that being said, the Enlightenment is cast now, when historians look back on the Enlightenment, they think of it as sort of a revolution away from religion and towards science. And I have to clarify, the idea that science and faith are in conflict is a myth, and it is wrong, all right? There are some Protestant denominations who we would call fundamentalists. And we would say that some of these denominations will take a very literal interpretation of the Bible and do some calculations based on the ages of some of the figures of the people in the Bible and determine the earth is only 6,000 years old when science tells us it's much, much older. Or they'll reject evolution as being in conflict with the Bible and say, on page 3 of the Bible, it legitimately says in Genesis chapter 2, it says that, the animals were created, that human beings were created. And so there's this idea that there's an incompatibility between the Bible and what science teaches. I want to clarify, for Catholics, that conflict does not exist. And for many Protestants, that conflict does not exist. It all depends on how you read the Bible. And the idea that the Bible ought to be interpreted literally is new. Some people say, well, the Bible was always read literally since the ancient times. It might surprise you to know that some of the earliest church fathers in around 300 AD, before the church even went mainstream with Constantine in 313, there were church fathers who were writing documents asking questions like, were Adam and Eve literal people, or was that figurative? So to think that the church has always said Adam and Eve were literal and then science came and now there are all these... It's a myth. It's wrong, okay? So all along, the church was willing to see that there were certain parts of the Bible that were meant to be poetic And there are other parts that are meant to be literal, right? That could still, your scientific modern mind might still ask, well, did Jesus really walk on water or not? And that's a whole debate that you could get into. But the Gospels are considered to be much more historically reliable than a book in the Bible like Genesis, which was meant to be poetic. And there are other parts in the Bible that confirm that it's meant to be poetic. And questions asked, like God asks Job, where were you when I created the universe? Well, one might ask the same question of the person who wrote Genesis. No one was around when the universe was created. No one was around when human beings first came into being. So the description in that Bible passage is about the relationship between God and man, and God giving those human faculties that make us made in God's image and likeness to us, built into our design. Can evolution be responsible for that? Absolutely. And the Catholic Church would say definitely yes. Many Protestant denominations would say definitely yes. You do find, though, as a result of this dogma of sola scriptura, remember, Protestants believe that only the Bible has authority. And so some have taken that to an extreme to say, okay, well, if the Bible is got to be like the highest level of authority, then we got to read it word for word literally. And that, among other things, has lent itself to this myth that science and religion are in a fight or in conflict. The Catholic perspective is that science and reason and intellect and math and logic and all of those are good things that were given to us as a gift by God. And so anyone who claims that there's a conflict between the two is not recognizing the fact that truth cannot contradict truth. So if God created a universe according to certain scientific principles and rules, science can only help us in coming to know God and coming to understand the universe. Well, the Enlightenment is this movement where some of these Christian principles, these ideas that the universe is built by a creator who built it with a certain amount of logic and built it with a certain amount of testability, put order into it. And you can think it's actually kind of interesting and maybe surprising that the way people used to think about the world in really successful civilizations like ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, right, ancient Babylon, they all had these many gods, and all of these gods were doing all these mysterious things. And at the same time as these ancient people were building really cool pyramids or really gorgeous domes or really sophisticated aqueducts, right, that show a lot of logic and reason, they were fully also believing that, that there were these mysterious forces in nature, and that the river was a god, and that the sun was a god, and to question how it worked or to figure out what it is actually could be offensive to that god, and so we better not do that. Christianity is actually, in many ways, makes room for the way of thinking, the scientific way, to come into existence, because it is these beliefs that there is one universe created by one God, and that God made rules and gave order to that universe. It's those beliefs that actually lend themselves to scientific thinking in the first place. If I, use this cool piece of glass to magnify that plant leaf, I bet it's going to have a structure inside. And when I look at that structure, I bet I'm going to be able to tell how it works just by looking at it, because God made this, God made me, He gave me reason. Those are all religious beliefs. And to even think now that scientists don't have beliefs that they base their teachings on, well, two of the most fundamental beliefs of science are that there are laws of the universe that the universe follows, and that those laws can be known by human beings correctly. The humans can come to the correct understanding of those things if we test and we repeat. Now, there are definitely new things about the scientific method that faith wasn't doing. But I'm just trying to show you there's a compatibility and there's a harmony in those two disciplines of science and theology. And if you're lucky, you'll get to learn more about that in your senior year. And if you're unlucky, you'll have to do it with me again. All right. So the Enlightenment is this period where people are questioning, people are beginning to develop a scientific method, people are rejecting dogma to a certain extent, or at least challenging assumptions. And there is some opposition to religion here, but again, don't read history with too much of our modern myth kind of revising history going on the back. Some famous names you probably heard from this Enlightenment time include Descartes, Isaac Newton, Copernicus, Galileo, Hume, Kant, Voltaire. These are all names associated with the Enlightenment. And the reason that we had to do this little bit of background on what the Enlightenment is because it's going to lead in very nicely into what the reasons are behind Vatican I and the declaration that Vatican I makes as regards the Pope. More on that in our next video.